Hey guys, you guys are going to have your first quiz this week. It is going to be posted and I'll have all of the instructions posted with it, but please email me if you have any questions and please make sure you get them submitted on time. Today we're going to talk about federalism in the United States Constitution, which is a really important thing to talk about, especially in today's time. It's an important concept that I'm still learning about, even though I've spent my entire career in this. But anyway, hang tight. We'll get through this. So what if we forgot all about our Constitution and suddenly we used the French Constitution, but we still had our same politicians and the buildings in place, but it just wouldn't be recognizable as American politics? Guys, it's not just the buildings or the people. It's the rules, the ideas, the narratives that give them life and meaning. Rules don't just drop from the sky. They're written and ready to be implemented, created by human beings who want to establish procedures to help them and those like them get what they want from the system. If you change the rules, you change who is advantaged and disadvantaged by those rules. Founders wanted rules, but they disagreed about what rules should be the basis of our government. They had to craft new rules to achieve their goal of a government whose authority came from the people, but whose power was limited so as to preserve the liberty of those people. Rules that fail to meet this test are inconsistent with the narrative of liberty and self-rule that they're promoting. But the rules that did limit self-rule had to be couched in terms that made them seem to be strengthening freedom. So how should laws be made? By whom? Should we have a parliament model with lords and commons? Should we have two houses at all? What about an executive branch? Should we have a king? Should it be one person? Should it be a lot of people? How much power should the executive have? How should he or she be chosen? How do we keep it so not one person is too all-powerful? How can the system change with the times but still provide for a stable government? Guys, this is what the Constitution is. It's the official rule book here. We have three branches of government. All governments have the power to legislate, the legislative branch, to administer laws, the executive branch, and to adjudicate, to interpret the laws. That's the judicial branch. So the legislative branch. The legislative power is a lawmaking power. It can be created by a ruler or by a party, divined from religion, made by citizens have to obey these laws. A legislature is the body of government that makes the laws. It can be set up differently by one chamber or two. Members can be elected or appointed, can be hereditary, elected by the people or by some other body. And then, of course, a bicameral legislature, like I've mentioned before, like bicycle, bi meaning two. Bicameral legislature is the legislature with two chambers. In the United States, they're elected for 2 years in the House and 6 years in the Senate. So in Federalist number 10, James Madison argued that laws should be made by the representatives, not by the people. He rejected the idea of pure democracies, of small political systems where the citizens can make and administer their own laws. He recommended a republic, a government where decisions are made through representatives of the people. The advantages here are that the dangers of factions are reduced and that people running the government are presumably the best equipped for this. He was disillusioned with the Articles of Confederation, so he set up a system where the few have more power than the many, and they justified it by claiming enhanced freedom. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution spells out the specific powers of Congress. We always had to cite this in Congress when you file a new bill, when you're writing a new piece of legislation. You have to cite constitutional authority. We always wrote Article 1, Section 8. It is the necessary and proper clause. You can do what is necessary and proper to carry out the duties of the country. It's interpreted broadly by the Supreme Court, and there are very few restrictions on it. The House of Representatives is intended to be representative of the people, the people's house, and the voice of the common man. To be elected, you have to be 25 years old in the House. You have to be a citizen for 7 years. Your terms only are for 2 years. So members are running constantly, and they're ousted constantly according to public whim. But that was intentional, as founders wanted this to be an accessible office and easy to influence based on changes in public opinion. In the Senate, you have to be 30, a citizen for 9 years, older, wiser, more stable. Your term lasts for 6 years, so you're not quite as easily swayed by changing public sentiment. They were originally not elected by the people, but by members of their state legislature, which would ensure a higher caliber of citizen and a more aristocratic body, like the British House of Lords, who are admitted by birth, not by achievement or election. Not election. By birth or achievement, not election. Unicameral. So this is a possible alternative. The unicameral legislation, a legislature with only one chamber. Some advantages of a unicameral legislature, why can't I talk, would be that lawmaking would be faster and more efficient. You'd be more responsive to changes in public opinion, good for democracy, but more of a sense of identity with government, implying that the whole country shares the same fundamental interests. The founders rejected unicameralism for different reasons, because mostly it's difficult for legislatures to represent more than one set of interests in society. The people represented in one house and the states were represented in the other, in the system that we set up here. Also, a quick legislative responsiveness of a unicameral legislature can be tough. It's better to have a smaller, safer unit to protect it from an abuse of power. George Washington explained bicameral legislation by saying, just as one pours one's coffee into a saucer to cool it off, which is a common practice for them, we pour legislation into a senatorial saucer to cool it. Cooling the passions of each chamber and passing a law twice keeps a legislature in check. All right, so the executive branch. An executive is the branch of government responsible for putting the laws into effect. This is where the United States president is. He is not part of the legislature, but he can propose, encourage, and veto legislation. The articles provided for no executive at all. They worried this would threaten their liberty, but under the chaos under the Articles of Confederation, it made it clear that a stronger government was needed and that an executive was necessary. The founders were worried about a tyrannical power that they had just escaped from. So they really wanted to know how to set this up. They wanted to know, should an executive be more than one person? Should he seek re-election? How many times? Should he be elected by the people or by the legislature? If more than one, how would power be divided? If elected by Congress, he would be dependent on Congress and fail to provide an adequate check on them in order to curry favor to be reelected. So there was really no trust in the people, though, so popular election was suspect. Hamilton wanted the president to serve for life to eliminate all these problems of being dependent on Congress or popular will, which is a very king-like thing. What's the Constitution say? The president will be a single executive, only one person, to serve an unlimited number of 4-year terms, which of course was amended in 1951, limited to 2 elected terms. They would be chosen neither by Congress or by the people, but instead by the Electoral College. We're going to dig way into the Electoral College later on this semester. But the Electoral College is an intermediary body that elects the president. Citizens vote not for the candidates, but for a slate of electors. They cast their votes for the candidates about 6 weeks after the general election. Those electors could have no other lawmaking power and could not be bribed or influenced by candidates. Article 2 establishes the executive. They have a 4-year term. They have to be a natural-born citizen, 35 years old, a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. It says that the vice president will serve if the president cannot, and then Congress determines succession after that. It gives them the power of commander-in-chief of military. They can grant pardons with advice and consent of the Senate, appoint ambassadors, the Supreme Court, etc. It also says they need to have a State of the Union. They can call or adjourn sessions of Congress, execute laws, commission officers. They can also be impeached for reasons of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Some possible alternatives to this system. The presidential system is a government where the executive is chosen independently of the legislature and the 2 branches are separate. Executive is independent and can be impeached for criminal activity. In a parliamentary system, this is a government where the executive is chosen by the legislature from among its members and the 2 branches are merged. The executive is accountable to the legislature. Parliament can remove executives for political or ideological disagreement. A vote of no confidence in Bill Clinton would have worked instead of failing to find criminal fault in his actions. It's easier for a prime minister to get his agenda passed, and the ties of a political party are really strong in a parliamentary system. All right, and then the judicial branch. Judicial power is the power to interpret laws and judge whether a law has been broken. Because of this, they also end up making a lot of laws. Their constitutional provisions here are brief and vague, and they're mostly left to Congress to arrange, but are often mentioned in the Federalist Papers. In Federalist 78, Hamilton said the judiciary was the least threatening branch of power, that the executive and legislature can endanger liberty, but not the judiciary, so all must be separate. The executive holds the sword, the legislature commands the purse. The judicial branch has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. He didn't want it to be too powerful or too political, so the justices were appointed for life, provided good behavior to preserve them from politics. They were to do what is just and constitutional, not what's popular. Judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to rule on the, the constitutionality of laws. In 1803, Marbury versus Madison, Justice John Marshall ruled that the Supreme Court is the ultimate interpreter of when a law is unconstitutional. This is not an automatic part of lawmaking, only if a law is challenged and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. What's the Constitution say about the judicial branch? It's really short. Power is vested in one Supreme Court and inferior courts, lifetime appointment as long as good behavior. But the role of courts in America has been left defined by Congress and by the courts themselves. What is a possible alternative? Legislative supremacy. It's the acceptance of legislative acts as the final law of the land, which underlies British politics. They have no written constitution. So the Supreme Court is therefore more powerful and the legislature is less powerful than Parliament. So the separation of powers and checks and balances are something that we're really what our country was built on. Separation of powers is the institutional arrangement that assigns judicial, executive, and legislative powers to different persons or groups, thereby limiting the powers of each. A French philosopher explained this notion, arguing that by putting all political power into one set of hands is like putting all of our eggs into one basket. If one goes bad, they all go bad. If power is divided, one may go bad, but the other two will be okay. Checks and balances are the principle that allows each branch of government to exercise some form of control over the others. It ensures that no branch can exercise power tyrannically. The president can veto Congress. Congress can override a veto. Supreme Court can declare a law unconstitutional. Congress can amend the Constitution with help from the states. In Federalist 51, James Madison wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary." But y'all, we're not angels. We're not governed by angels. Human nature is flawed. Humans can be greedy, corrupt, ambitious, and precautions need to be taken. So the separation of powers and checks and balances were used in this way. Separation of powers was an easy thing for the founders, but the checks and balances part was not. What's the Constitution say? Article 1, bicameral legislature, both houses must agree. That checks on each other. The presidential veto can check Congress. Congress can override that veto and check the president. Congress can impeach the president or the Supreme Court and check them. The president can recommend laws but not write them. He can appoint judges, confirmed only by the Senate, grant pardons, which is checking the judiciary. He's the commander-in-chief, but only Congress can declare war. In Article 3, the Supreme Court, they have judicial review that's established in Marbury versus Madison. This is a check on legislative and executive branches. Congress can amend the Constitution and check the judiciary. No branch can act independently, but none is dependent on the others. This is separation of powers and checks and balances is uniquely American. Federalism, balancing the power between national and state governments. It's clear in the Constitution that national government trumps states, though the narrative of shared power has allowed both sides to come together around this concept. Effects of federalism that we see today are income taxes that we pay to national government parcels out of money to the states. They can be spent on programs like welfare, healthcare, highways, education. Local schools are funded by local property taxes. State universities are supported by state taxes, but they're all subject to national laws, like schools must be open to all races. Even when it's a state law, national government can sometimes enforce its will, like a drinking law. The state can decide on a minimum drinking age, but the federal government started to withhold part of their federal highway funds until the drinking age of 21 was passed, under the guise of making roads safer, similar for drunk driving, blood alcohol levels. So, the federal government can get involved in either way. What's the Constitution say? Local government's not mentioned at all in the Constitution, totally under the jurisdiction of the states. The Constitution is mostly concerned with the powers of national government. Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers of Congress, congressional powers specifically named in the Constitution. And then the necessary and proper clause, constitutional authorization for Congress to make any laws required to carry out its powers, also called the elastic clause because it can be stretched to be interpreted so broadly. And then, of course, the supremacy clause in Article 6 is the constitutional declaration that the Constitution and laws made under its provision are the supreme law of the land. Our 10th Amendment says all powers not given to the national government are reserved for the states. but necessary and proper clause makes this hard to see what is withheld from the national government. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared by the federal and state government. All right, so you've got two views of federalism. The view of dual federalism, which is a federal system where the national and state governments are responsible for separate policy areas. State and national government are to be two self-contained layers, each separate and carrying out functions independently from each other, but each supreme. There's a formal distinction in the Constitution and perhaps accurate judicial interpretation for about 100 years. And then you have cooperative federalism. This is the federal system under which the national and state governments share responsibility for most domestic areas. Instead of like two layers in a cake, they're swirled together like a chocolate and vanilla batter in a marble cake. Interdependent, but required cooperation of the others to get things done. A partnership where the dominant partner was usually the national government. What are some alternatives to federalism? It wasn't the first choice for the founders, but it was a compromise that borrows from a unitary system and a confederal system. A unitary system is a government where all power is centralized. Great Britain's this way. Local units have some power sometimes, but basically they're all dependent on the central unit. What if the national government could just suspend the state legislature in Alabama during segregation to run the state from D.C.? It's impossible in the United States, but not in Britain, except in the chaos following the Civil War. And then a confederal system is a government where local units hold all the power. So the central government is dependent on them for its existence. Local government is sovereign. The Articles of Confederation, the United Nations, the European Union. What difference does federalism make? Federalism gave the founders a government that could take effective action, restore economic stability, regulate disputes among the states, but also, also allow some autonomy in the states and a narrative that perhaps they have more power than they actually do. This gives flexibility to preserve local standards, to solve problems at levels where they occur, traffic laws, housing codes, school policies, etc. And it allows some experimentation with public policy. Some disadvantages are that different punishments for different crimes can make it difficult to gauge the consequences of behavior across the states. For example, marijuana. The laws for marijuana usage are different in every state. But states compete for industry, which is called smokestack chasing. So bids against each other to attract industry. And you have governments who land enterprises that are typically rewarded in the voting booth. So federalism, there's a reason that we're going to expect states to continue competing. Federalism has proven to be flexible and effective. As historic events occur, the demands on different levels of government change, including federal versus state, and government, state and federal, are growing in size. We make more demands on our government than were made in Washington's time. We have a bigger country. We have a more diverse economy than we did back then. The country's grown bigger, more industrial, more urban, more technical. We expect and need more from our government. But we also want to protect our rights, and now that's more than just 10 amendments. We want economic security in old age, a minimum standard of living, safe highways, crime-free neighborhoods. Liberals tend to believe in a strong central government to solve social problems like discrimination and poverty. Conservatives tend to think that big government creates more problems than it solves. Like anti-federalists, they want more local and state government. So John Marshall, he really helped strengthen the constitutional powers of the national government. In 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland, this was the question of whether Congress could charter a bank and if Maryland could tax that bank. It was a Supreme Court ruling in 1819 that confirmed the supremacy of national over state government. And then in 1824, Gibbons versus Ogden, which is a Supreme Court ruling that established national authority over interstate business, interpreted broadly to include almost any kind of business. The Civil War, the national domination of the states. One of the largest issues of the Civil War was to resolve the question of national versus state supremacy. Nullification is the declaration by a state that a federal law is void within its borders. So southern states tried to maintain their own narrative by invoking this. Then they seceded, of course, from the United States to reject this national authority. But the Union showed that the states did not retain sovereignty under the Constitution. Under the New Deal, for example, the Supreme Court maintained an anti-regulation stance, but the president berated the Supreme Court for striking down his program. So we'll talk a lot more about the New Deal later this semester. Excuse me. Eventually, the Supreme Court had a change of heart, and once established as constitutional, New Deal policies have really redefined the purpose of American government and the scope of state and national powers. Social Security was born during the New Deal, and a lot of other national programs designed to get America back to work and back on its feet. What about federalism today? Federalism is a renegotiated compromise between advocates of a strong national government on one hand and advocates of state power on the other. If a party dominates in federal government for a long time, its members become accustomed to looking there to accomplish their aims. The minority party then looks to the states. They have to fight to have their decisions made in the arena where they are most likely to prevail. Devolution is the transfer of powers and responsibilities from the federal government to the states. And most questions of contemporary federalism involving the national government are trying to influence how the states and localities go about providing goods and services and regulating behaviors that have traditionally been within their jurisdictions. There's some policies, like Social Security, that are easy to administer at the national levels. Other, like changing education policy, that need to remain under state authority and can't really be altered in D.C. How does the national government try to influence the states? They can talk about the character of the rules, the cost of the rules, who will pay for it. There are 4 general congressional strategies for influencing the states. First is no national government influence. The second is something called a categorical grant, which is federal funds for providing specific purposes and restricted by detailed instructions, regulations, and compliances. If a state complies, they'll get the federal money. If they don't comply, they don't get the money. And then there's something called a block grant, which is federal funds provided for a broad purpose and unrestricted by detailed requirements and regulations, which states have considerable freedom in using in broad policy areas. And then something called an unfunded mandate, which is a federal order mandating that states operate and pay for a program created at the national level, which imposes a specific policy requirement on the state but doesn't provide a way to pay for these activities. Instead, Congress forces states to comply by threatening criminal or civil penalties or promising to cut off other, often unrelated federal funds if the state doesn't follow its directions. For example, the Real ID Act is required to have will be required for having to have a real ID for doing businesses with a federal agency, including traveling in an airport. It's costs about $11 billion, which is shouldered mostly by the states. Of course, they have delayed implementation on this many, many times. The current status of federalism is a mix of narratives about returning the powers of the states and new national incentives like healthcare, education, and environment. But members of a Congress are elected locally, and they have primary loyalties to their constituencies and not to a national audience. National inaction, when are we going to do something, has left this policy vacuum being filled with state policy initiatives. If a constitution is a rule book, its capacity to be changed over time is critical to it remaining a viable political document. The amendability of it is important, the provision for the Constitution to be changed so as to adapt to new circumstances. We've had over 10,000 amendments introduced, but the Constitution's only been formally amended 27 times. There have been recent calls for amendments on banning abortion, banning gay marriage, banning flag burning, permitting prayer in schools, usually very partisan camp divides. Democrats typically believe that change is inevitable and that the Constitution is a living, flexible document that can have small alterations. Republicans are suspicious of change and believe that the founders' work need not be tampered with by unelected judges. They'll change in fundamental ways, but preferably by an amendment. Article 5 spells out the confusing process for amending the Constitution. You have to have either a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate, or when 2/3 of the state requests a constitutional convention, has to be approved by the legislature of 3/4 of the states or by the conventions of 3/4 of the states. Totally confusing. Some states make it harder to amend their own constitutions. There are 12 states that make amendments pass in more than one session of the legislature in successive years. Some states make it easier, giving citizens a substantial role in the process through referenda and initiatives. But public opinion can be fickle, and we may not always want the Constitution to respond easily to a whim. The California Constitution, for example, has been amended more than 500 times instead of being subject to ordinary legislation. Do you think it's the fundamental importance of a constitution is trivialized by cluttering it with too many amendments that can be dealt with in other ways? Our Constitution in the United States has weathered the test of time for 2 reasons. It's not too detailed and explicit, and it guards against the extreme faculty which would render the Constitution too mutable and the extreme difficulty which might perpetuate its discovered flaws. Benjamin Franklin said he'd created a republic, madam, if you can keep it. But the Constitution only allows the slimmest of roles in keeping the republic. In fact, it profoundly limits citizens' participation. But founders wanted it this way. They didn't trust human beings to know their best interests or how to handle power without being corrupted. They wanted popular power to serve as a potential check on the elected leaders, but they wanted to impose strict checks on popular power as well. The Constitution was the Republic's insurance against chaos and instability. There are 3 formal mechanisms of direct democracy at the state level. An initiative, which is when a citizen petitions to place a proposal or constitutional amendment on the ballot to be adopted or rejected by a majority vote, thus bypassing the legislature. If it receives a majority vote, it's adopted and becomes law. This is the principal way that changes are made to state law in California. There is a referendum, an election by which bills are passed by the state legislature and submitted to voters for approval. A lot of states require constitutional amendments to do this. And some states require the questions of taxation to be this way. And then something called a recall election, which is a vote to remove an elected official from office. They require petitions of generally about 25% of the electorate, and they're infrequent but notable, especially in California. All right, so your questions to think about today. Again, you don't have to email me, but I want you to think about these. They could be things that we could talk about later on exams. Why did the founders choose to structure the 3 branches of government the way they did? How has the flexibility of our Constitution allowed it to change with the times? Should it be more or less flexible than it currently is? Does the Constitution foster or limit citizen participation in the government? Just some things to think about. All right, guys, email me if you have any questions, and let me know if you have any questions about how to take the first quiz. Thanks so much, guys.